Good evening. So there are a lot of you here, and that's kind of funny to me, because I wrote this talk 8 years ago in a library thinking that I was just being crafty and not really preparing to, expecting to share this information publicly. You see, the thing is that in 2018, I was finishing my doctorate, and I was preparing to go in the job market, and the competition's relatively fierce, so you have to at least pretend to be a good person until you get tenure, and then you can be whoever you want, so you have to play nice. So I picked a nice innocuous topic that nobody cares about, and I called Usury. But the reason I picked it was because I thought that I could spin it both liberal and conservative. And I know where I am, so I'm just going to speak plainly. But to the liberals, you can talk about social justice issues and the rich preying on the poor and things like that, and that's why we should care about Usury. To the conservatives, you can talk about this long-forgotten doctrine that Aquinas was totally right about and everyone today is totally wrong about, and they'll love that. So I, did that, and it worked. And then my better half, my wife, when I first got my first job in Baltimore, the Johns Hopkins University, which is around the corner, opened a TI chapter. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. I would love to do that. She goes, well, why don't you ask if you can? And I said, well, that's not how it works. You don't know anything. And she goes, no, just ask. And I went, oh, okay. So I did, and they put me on the list, and they said, what can you talk about? And I was like, I don't know, this, that. Usury, I guess. I just wrote a talk on it. And here we are. So you know why I care about it. I'll be very interested to know why you care about it. I suspect that part of the reason why people are starting to care about it is because it does seem like this massive contradiction. There's this universal condemnation of a practice that now seems universally condoned. Also because it definitely seems to be having a greater impact in people's lives. Lots of people have loans with relatively high interest rates, and they feel trapped in them and so on. But here's what we'll do. I'll get into the history behind the Catholic position on usury. We'll talk about the Old Testament, the New Testament, and then we'll get into the Middle Ages, and in particular into Aquinas, and that's where we'll really get into the logic of the position. And then we can talk about some later developments and their applications for today. So the Old Testament does bring up usury a bit. We hear it in Psalm 15, which among the characteristics of the holy man is the one who does not give his money upon usury. Leviticus says something similar. It says in chapter 25, do not exact interest in advanced or accrued interest. And then in Deuteronomy, there's a little qualification in chapter 23. From a foreigner you may demand interest, but you may not demand interest from your kindred, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings on the land you are to enter and possess. I would note two things about these passages. The first is that they were among those quoted in early church synods, which shows you how Catholics understood usury at the time. They understood it as a sin against charity. And second, I would note that the prohibition against usury did not apply to taking interest from foreigners. Thomas Aquinas would later argue that due to the new covenant, unlike the old covenant that applied to the Israelites, this prohibition now extends to everyone because everyone is your neighbor. So charity extends to everybody. Therefore, the prohibition extends to everybody. The New Testament doesn't talk about usury too much, but one of the verses that's cited most frequently in medieval conversations is Luke 6:35, which says, but rather love your enemies and do good to them and lend expecting nothing back, which a lot of medieval scholastics took to be a prohibition against usury. Now, how about the documents of the church? In 325, the year 325, we find a condemnation of usury from the First Council of Nicaea, which of course gave us the bulk of the creed that we recite at Sunday Mass today. And Canon 17 of the Council says, for as much as many enrolled among the clergy, following covetousness of lust and gain, have forgotten the divine scripture which says, he has not given his money upon usury, Ezekiel, and in lending money ask the hundredth of the sum, which is an interest rate. The Holy and Great Synod thinks it just that if after this decree anyone be found to receive usury, whether he accomplish it by secret transaction or otherwise, as by demanding the whole and one half, or by using any contrivance whatsoever for filthy lucre's sake, he shall be deposed from the clergy and his name stricken from the list. I miss those councils. It would be so nice if we could just, let's just list everything we don't like about you. Okay, in the 5th century, moving on a bit, we have a document from Pope Leo the Great, Nec Hoc Quoque. This forbids clerics in particular from taking usury and accuses interest-taking laymen as seeking turpe lucrum, filthy profit. In the year 850, there was the Synod of Pavia, which excommunicated lay usurers and prescribes full restitution to their victims if living, or half the usury taken to the heirs. And then finally, I want to talk about the Second Lateran Council of 1139, which was an ecumenical council convened by Pope Innocent II. So it, in no uncertain terms, was taken to apply to the whole church. It says, furthermore, we condemn that practice accounted despicable and blameworthy by divine and human laws, denounced by Scripture in the Old and New Testaments, namely the ferocious greed of usurers. And we sever them from every comfort of the church, forbidding any archbishop or bishop or an abbot or any order whatever, or anyone in clerical orders, going down the list here, just to make sure we got everybody, to dare to receive usurers unless they do so with extreme caution, but let them be held infamous throughout their whole lives, unless they repent and be deprived of a Christian burial. I think I need to stop for a minute. Got a little excited there. These are the statements. We have our scripture. We've got our condemnations. Condemnations are fun because they're clear. They tell you what is the case. They usually don't tell you why. So let's get into that. Why is usury such a problem? In the Middle Ages, the discussion of usury, I would say, begins with St. Anselm, who lived in the 11th and 12th centuries, and he classified usury as robbery. He doesn't talk about it too much, but the classification as robbery becomes influential because, as we saw in Scripture, usury was seen as a sin against charity. Now he sees it as a sin against justice. Calls it robbery, so it's a sin against justice. A little later, we find in the writings of William of Auxerre a bit more developed account. He defines usury as the will of acquiring something through a loan beyond the principal. And he says that it is opposed to the virtue of piety, and it is wrong secundum se. That is, it is wrong in itself, it is intrinsically wrong. And he actually defines what is malum secundum se, evil secundum se, as something that not even God can tell you to do. Furthermore, he says, William of Auxerre says that usurers sell time. That's where he locates the problem. He says time is proper to all creatures, and it cannot be sold. He says that because a person takes usury does not mean that usury is justified, and that a person may take usury if no other options are available. So in other words, he blames the lender, not the borrower. If you have no choice but to take out a loan for something you need to do, well, you can do that, but shame on the person who lent it to you. Thomas Aquinas' own teacher, St. Albert the Great, gives us the benefit of adding Aristotle into the mix, into this conversation. Aristotle discusses usury in his Nicomachean Ethics and his Politics. And what he condemns in the Politics is, he says there that there are two ways of accruing wealth, of wealth making. One he calls management, the other is awkwardly translated as retail trade. But retail trade is effectively what he means by making money off of money. So you lend money, and then you make money by virtue of the fact that you had it and lent it. And for him, the real problem in doing that is that the proper kind of wealth getting results from the labor that people put into something. People work together on an enterprise, they contribute their skills to it, they contribute their craftiness to it, and they make something better than it was there before, and they are justly compensated for it. But he says that the person who just makes money off of money doesn't actually contribute anything to the economy. So he doesn't say too much besides St. Albert. He gives us this consideration from Aristotle. And then we get to Aquinas. And Aquinas, as you know, is a master synthesizer. He quotes the Bible from memory like it's nobody's business. He knows tons of the church fathers. He's also very interested in Greek philosophy. So he pulls all this together into an absolutely masterful account. And just so you know, since you're here, I think you know this, Aquinas is kind of a big deal. How big a deal is he? Okay, he died at the age of 49. He had to have special permission from the Pope to begin teaching theology before the age of 35. Do a little quick math there. He didn't have a very long career. And the Dominicans, although they gave him a dispensation from praying the whole office so that he could write as much as possible, he didn't work on feast days. And in their calendar, they had a lot of those. So if you take the number of pages of writing from Aquinas that we have today, and you typed it all up on 8.5 by 11 paper like this, and then you divide the number of pages by the number of working days in that man's career, you get the number 10. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote 10 pages of theology per day. And it's not like Red Bull-fueled, my paper's due tomorrow, the kind of writing that I would produce in college. It's like, it's Aquinas writing. It's kind of, I just want to make sure, I don't know why I'm saying this. I guess the point is I want us all to feel nice and inadequate before we approach the master for wisdom. What then did Aquinas say? Well, we'll start at the beginning of his career, because most people don't. They jump straight to the Summa. The Summa is great and all, but he wrote a lot before that, and a lot in addition at the same time. And I think a part of the reason most people don't start earlier is because it wasn't translated into English until recently. So this is from Aquinas' Sentences. If you've heard of the Sentences commentary, nowadays to get a doctorate, if you want to get a Ph.D. in theology, you have to write and defend the dissertation. Back then, in order to get the equivalent degree, you had to comment on Peter Lombard's Sentences. And the Sentences of Peter Lombard was essentially a collection and commentary on the sayings of the Church Fathers organized by topic. It was a standard textbook in Aquinas' day. It's a massive work. The poor students back then spent years and years working on it. And here's what he says there. Aquinas, in his commentary, says that money is a medium of exchange. It is essentially a measurement of value. And based on this definition, Aquinas already has a problem with usury. He says, to receive a greater sum of money in return for less seems to be nothing other than to diversify the measure in receiving and in giving. Okay, so what does that mean? We have to draw out in particular what it means to diversify the measure. Aquinas does not just mean to say that more money was paid in exchange for less. Rather, what he means is that the nature of money is distorted by this practice. Money is supposed to provide people with a measurement of the value of something. It's the means that a society uses to set a value on something, and that is the price of that thing. But the problem with usury is that it sets a price on money itself. So the thing that is used to set prices now has a price. Consequently, money can no longer serve its social function, just as a ruler that is measured by a ruler using different units can no longer be trusted to measure length. Now, if this practice is multiplied, if it becomes commonplace, it's not hard to see what would happen. Usurers habitually would put a price on money itself. They, therefore, get to sell their money for more than it would otherwise be worth, and they thereby make money simply by virtue of having money. Meanwhile, the borrowers are paying more for less. Now, this might not make much sense for a rational person to do. Why would you take out a loan in such circumstances? But when practices like this become socially enforced, they become commonplace to the extent that you can't not do them, they create something of a prisoner's dilemma. So, for example, if you have an opportunity that you can't afford to pay for, you can borrow from a lender at interest and get ripped off. Or you could save up your money. But if everyone else borrows from the usurer at interest, the market is flooded with money, and the cost of the good in question goes up. such that it even becomes impossible to buy it at all without borrowing at interest. At this point, the practice of usury has become what sociologists would call socially enforced. It might seem like individuals are free rational agents who can make their own financial decisions independently, but that is not the case. They are now stuck in a system where they have little choice but to borrow at interest for the good in question. This, I would argue, is exactly what happened in the United States with student loans. If you can consider the history of the situation. When the baby boomer generation was graduating high school, they were entering into an economy that was increasingly information-based. And unlike most things, this was not their fault. A college education was thus more, yeah, you got it, that little jab there. It was subtle, but it was there. A college education was thus more important for the average person than it had been in the recent past. And it seemed to the federal government that it would benefit the economy of the United States if more people obtained a college degree. But of course, not everyone could afford the tuition. So the administration of President Lyndon Johnson wanted to know whether it would be better to fund higher education by providing money to the institutions directly or to the students so that they could then use it to pay the institution's tuition. An economist in President Johnson's administration named Alice Rivlin made the case that it would be better to put the money directly into the hands of the students, which was done through a combination of loans and grants. The effect of this is exactly what one would expect if one had read Aquinas' commentary on the sentences. Too bad it hadn't been translated into English. Poor President Johnson. The market was flooded with free cash, or at least cash that seems free in the eye of a 17-year-old. It's amazing what happens if you try to investigate why it is that college tuition has climbed 1,375% since 1978. Meanwhile, the consumer price index has gone up 303% in the same time period, while healthcare costs have gone up 730%, and the price of a new car 98%. Answers to this problem, to the cause of this problem, range from administrative bloat, which I take umbrage at because I'm a dean, thank you, to luxury dormitories, mine were not luxurious, to the salaries of football coaches, well, maybe there's a case to be made there, and even professors. Don't know which professors they asked, but they're not making bank, I can promise you that. Almost no one until recently talked about student loans as a potential cause of the problem, and yet it seems clear that they should. If there were not student loans, then no student could pay more for college than the amount of money that he had in his pocket. Administrative, lodging, and athletic costs simply could not increase. Whatever the role of usury plays in this problem, it should be clear at the very least that it does enable this kind of price increase to happen. So in sum, what Aquinas says in his early work is that one of the problems with usury is that it disconnects money from its natural purpose. It is no longer able to be used as a measure of price since it itself has a price, and this causes the prices of things to be distorted. The truth of this claim can be seen when you zoom out and focus on what would happen if the practice of usury were to become widespread. Now we can go into the heart of the matter and investigate what Aquinas says in his Summa. The most well-known passage where Aquinas discusses usury is in the first article of question 78 of the Secunda Secundae, where Aquinas argues that to charge interest on a loan is to charge twice for the same thing and thereby renders the transaction unjust. This does not sound logical to the modern ear. Did not Aquinas understand the time value of money? Did he not understand that lenders do a service to borrowers, especially since they take risks in making loans? Aquinas was very aware of these objections, and he did disagree with them. So let's consider first why Aquinas thinks that it is immoral to charge interest on a loan. Again, Aquinas thinks that charging interest on a loan is to charge both for the money lent and for the use of the money. It is a double charge. The reason for this has to do with the nature of money itself. Money is a medium of exchange, and it is therefore categorized by Aquinas as a consumable. This category traces its origin back to Roman law. The ancient Romans also forbade usury, and it was on the basis of this logic. Consumables are things that are consumed in their use, according to the Romans. And these things could not be rented, but they could only be bought or sold. Why is that? Well, consider the difference between renting and owning. What can an owner do that a renter cannot? A renter can use a rented house, but he cannot buy it or sell it. That is, he cannot exchange it for something else over which he then acquires ownership. And he also cannot destroy it. But that's what happens with consumables. Money is exchanged. When you buy something, you don't have it anymore. And wine is consumed. When you drink it, it is gone. Consider the case of wine more practically. According to its proper use, wine is drunk. This doesn't mean that you can't do other things with it, just like you could consider money a collector's item rather than a means of exchange. But we're talking about its proper use. Imagine you are having a friend over for dinner, or let's just pretend you're all graduate students because this involves drinking wine, or we're in Canada or something where they have a sensible drinking age, I don't know. I should have thought more about the setting before I did this. In any event, imagine when you're of legal age, you're having a friend over for dinner, one for whom you prepare a nice steak dinner, only to realize at the last minute that you don't have any wine to serve with it. Quel dommage, how terrible a host you are. In a panic, you run over to your neighbor's house and beg her to lend you a bottle of wine to serve with dinner. She agrees and she hands you a bottle. You serve it to your friend, and all is well. The next day, you run to the liquor store, you buy a bottle of wine, or you get somebody who's of legal age to buy it for you, of the same brand and vintage as the one your neighbor lent you, and then you go to your neighbor's house and give her the new bottle of wine, and she says, "Thanks, but where is the rest?" You say, "What rest? You gave me a bottle, and I'm giving you one back." She goes, "Well, that's all well and good, but you drank the first bottle. It's gone. I want to be compensated for my loss." You reply that you are compensating her for her loss by offering her another bottle. But she insists otherwise. Miffed, you return home and remind yourself never to borrow anything from that neighbor again. This is the logic behind the claim that consumables cannot be rented. Imagine if you tried. Instead of going to your neighbor's house, you try to rent a bottle from the liquor store. You pick up a bottle, you drink it with your friend, and then realizing that you can't return an empty bottle that you've rented to the store, you buy a new one and return it, and you pay a rental fee. You paid both for the bottle and for its use. That makes no sense. You should just buy it and then use it. It's not the kind of thing you can rent. So renting a consumable doesn't make any financial sense, and it can't. And here's one more element to Aquinas' argument. For Aquinas, as for the Romans, when you lend a consumable to somebody, you transfer ownership, necessarily, and you must. Because now that the person can consume or exchange the thing that you've handed over, remember, only the owner of something can dispose of it. And that is what the borrower does with borrowed money. Consequently, it is unjust and simply does not make financial sense for a lender to expect back the principal of a loan plus a fee. As a matter of justice in principle, the only thing that a lender can expect back from a borrower is what he had lent. So this, in sum, is the logic behind Aquinas' claim. To charge interest on a loan is to charge both for the money and for the use of that money. But since money is something that is consumed by being used, to charge for it and for its use is to charge twice for the same thing, which is unjust. This is different from the case of a house or a lawnmower, which are things that are not consumed in their use. I can rent a lawnmower to someone, that is, I can charge for its use, because a lawnmower remains intact after I used it. I can't charge someone for the use of wine, because when the wine is used, it is gone. So you can only charge for the wine itself and not for the use of the wine. Okay, what about the common objections? Probably the biggest one is time value. Does not the lender do a service to the borrower, enabling him to buy something that he otherwise could not? And does not the lender take a risk in lending money, which he could have saved or invested elsewhere? Possibly. But the bigger question is whether a lender is owed compensation for this, and Aquinas' answer is no. Furthermore, Aquinas and his contemporaries would bristle at the suggestion that a usurious lender does a service to a borrower. First off, Aquinas states quite simply that to expect to be compensated for a return that one could have generated elsewhere, it's a common argument, I could have invested it in the stock market or something, to be compensated for a return that you could have generated is to charge someone interest because you are foregoing an investment opportunity, which is effectively to sell what you do not have, or what you may never have. So you cannot charge someone interest on the basis that you are taking a risk or foregoing an investment opportunity. You can only charge for real things, not hypothetical things. But the heart of the matter is something deeper. To charge interest on a loan, because money is supposed to have time value, is for Aquinas to sell time. Aquinas does not, as far as I am aware, have any lengthy treatment of why selling time is problematic. But he clearly thinks that it is. So what is so bad about selling time? This, I think, Aquinas thinks it's obviously an immoral practice, and this isn't. But the reason he doesn't talk about it is not because nobody in his day was practicing usury. Far from it; it was relatively common. But rather because if you read his contemporaries and his immediate predecessors, they all find it quite clear that the practice of selling time is repugnant. William of Auxerre, who I'd mentioned before, Aquinas' predecessor, for example, argues that one cannot sell that which God gave to all in common. This would be taken to include not only time for him, but also sunlight and water. A lot of people object to that. They say, certainly you can sell water to people. William of Auxerre really doesn't think you can. You might say, well, it's bottled or it's filtered or it's this. He goes, sure, you're selling for what you did, you packaged it, you shipped it, you're selling for that. But he thinks it's fundamentally unjust to sell anybody what God already gave the person, and that includes time. This medieval expression of an idea is at the root of what today we call, in Catholic social teaching, the universal destination of goods. God gave the earth and all that is in it to mankind in common. Aquinas argues, for example, that private property exists for practical purposes, so as, for example, to make it clear who is responsible for what and to motivate people to work and things like that. But ideally, in a state of need, the goods that we have, the goods of the earth, belong to everyone. Consequently, it is unjust to charge somebody else for what God has given that person for free. One might object that we do this all the time, but Aquinas would either say, well, you're wrong, or he would often say, you're maybe doing something else. I think many of us, and I hope many of us, would think it unjust if a man in a nomadic desert community were to find an oasis, put a fence around it, and then charge anyone money who wanted access to the water, no matter how thirsty they were. I would also note that in later developments, after the high scholasticism period had ended in canon law, canon lawyers had come up with the idea of an extrinsic title, which meant that you could, in fact, charge a borrower for covering, for example, your administrative costs. And everyone seemed to think that that was just, if there was an actual real loss that you could say you were clearly undergoing and making the loan, then you could charge for that. And the reason why that isn't interest is because its price is set to something that you can actually measure, something other than the loan itself. And so sometimes borrowers or lenders in the 16th, 17th century would put a percentage of a fee on a loan that they were giving, which looks a lot like usury. But what they're doing is they're pegging the interest rate, as it were, the price of making the loan to their own administrative costs. And so at least in that system, there is an objective thing that you are using to set the price, and you're not just doing it simply because you are lending money to somebody. I would also note that it has become relatively common in some Catholic circles to argue that what I've said here also applies, for example, to investing in the stock market. I wanted to address that one because I knew a bunch of people who immediately closed their 401ks after listening to a podcast, which is a little bit premature. The arguments are usually this. First of all, it is unjust to sell something for more than its worth. That's true. Aquinas says as much. But a lot of people who make this argument will say that it is unjust. They'll take that to mean that it is unjust to sell something for more than you bought it for. And that's not true. Because the worth of things can change. Either because you yourself modify the thing and make it to be more attractive, or because the circumstances around the thing change. You buy a plot of land, the land around it is developed, now the land is more valuable. So the fact that a stock goes up in price and you sell it for more than you paid for it is not itself a problem. Other people note that part of the problem with owning stocks is that you don't actually work for the company that you invest in. You don't actually contribute any of your own labor. Generally speaking, that's true. You do have a very limited set of responsibilities. You do, for example, vote when you own stocks sometimes. Now, it is true that in Catholic social teaching, ownership comes with responsibility. It is less clear exactly what that responsibility is supposed to be. The main principle of Catholic social teaching is that your ownership is supposed to be exercised in view of the common good. But for example, there are plenty of people who own things for which they themselves do not assume responsibility, even if later they take responsibility for it. So for example, when you inherit something from somebody else. That's obviously just, but it also involves a person getting something that he didn't do anything for. So I think I'll end there. I'm sure that there are plenty of questions about contemporary practices and so on, but I teased out the logic and the history for you, so we can take it from here. Thank you. I got to say that's the hardest one right off the bat because I myself have struggled with this one a lot. And I'm going to go ahead and say that no, I don't think that you can charge interest on a loan to compensate yourself to loss accrued because of inflation. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that part of the reason why our society experiences so much inflation is precisely because of usurious practices which are enforcing it. Another one is I think it's too hardwired in our minds to simply presume that money is going to lose value over time. If you had been growing up in Japan all these years instead of the United States, you'd have the opposite expectation. Right? They're a deflationary economy. But I think more to the point that inflation is really an index. It is a catch-all for a whole bunch of things that are happening. And money is a medium of exchange for things, and the prices of those things change, but they don't all change in the same direction or at the same rate. So while it's true that you can look at the overall consumer price index and say, well, it tends to go up at 2% per year, and then COVID happened, and it went haywire, and so on. But the thing is that that's not true for all the things in the consumer price index. So you consider electronics, for example. Their prices tend to go down over time. So I think that we tend to reify things like inflation. And if you break it down into what it actually is, which is just the prices of things changing, then I don't think you can be justly compensated for it. Because then you'd be compensated for a hypothetical. It's not that it ought to be, it's just that it is. You can look at money in other ways. Like I said before, you can consider, I have a collection of coins. You can sell the coins qua collector's item and not spend them qua quarter, which would be very foolish because I have a quarter worth $25, But when you actually use money as money, the way it works is you give the person the money, and then you don't have it anymore, which is what enables you to assume ownership of the thing that's given to you. If you still owned the money, that is, it wasn't a consumable, then you wouldn't assume ownership either, because it has to be a trade. Somebody is relinquishing possession in exchange for something else. So it's simply the nature of the exchange that makes money to be a consumable. It's not because anyone made the decision to make it such. It is interesting to think about this a bit in a broad sense, because there are actually a lot of forms money can take. It can be shells, it can be gold, it can be green pieces of paper, or it can just be numbers on a screen. And I suppose that the most fungible form that we have is numbers on a screen, right? I mean, you take out a loan from a bank, they don't actually hand you $10,000. They just write on a computer that you now have $10,000 and make it so. But then they keep track of it, and you owe it to them back. And if you don't pay it, they are going to come after you for the amount that you owe. And I think that answers that question, because they're still able to come after it, even if it is fungible, and can therefore be easily, what does it mean for money to be fungible? I guess I should explain that, right? If I give you $10,000 for X, but you actually need $10,000 for Y, and I specifically earmark the money for X, you can take the other money that you had for X and use it to pay for Y, and then pay for X with the new funds, right? But there's still limits on that, because you can only do that insofar as you actually had enough money to pay for the other thing in the first place. So I still think that if we're treating money as money, then in order for it to work, it has to be exchanged. It has to be relinquished. You have to have less of it after you buy something, whether it's gold coins in a purse or numbers on a screen. I think one of the things that we often forget as contemporary Americans is that we are given everything that we have. Our bodies, our natures, our minds, our souls, and the economy that we get to live and work in. And the reason why we're even able to earn money is because of an economic system that is protected and regulated by the government. And what that means is that if we owe the very opportunity to work and thereby make money to the government, then it is just of the government to demand some of the proceeds of our labor. How would you get a loan? Yeah, there are some clever ways of doing it. We are so used to thinking about, let's back up a little bit here. 30-year mortgage is a new thing, relatively speaking. There's no sensible bank in the world that would decide to give every home-owning American a 30-year loan at a single-digit interest rate. That just doesn't make financial sense. It's backed up by it's designed by the federal government, the whole system. But we're just so used to it that we think, it would be impossible to own a house without a mortgage. And in our society, it is. But houses existed before mortgages and people lived in them. There are ways to do it. Now, some of them were kind of unsavory. So one of them was the tontine. A whole bunch of people would write their names on a piece of paper, and then whoever was the last one alive would get the house. That's illegal now. You can't do that for obvious reasons. But to be more practical, there are ways of making loans that don't involve usury. So let me tell you how, for example, a loan would work in an Islamic financial system. The Muslim bankers are very, very strict about usury, but they're also total legalists. So they have a law and they follow it strictly, but they also will try to find sneaky ways around it by calling things other things. But they have come up with some interesting stuff. So here's how a mortgage would work in Islamic finance. You want to buy a house, but you don't have enough money. So what you do is you ask a bank to buy the house with you. And you pay 20% of the house's cost, and the bank pays 80%. And then over time, you pay back the bank what you slowly buy the house back from them. You buy their share of it. And in the meantime, what you do is you pay them rent for the portion of the house that they own and you don't. And the rent fluctuates over time, and the price of the house fluctuates over time, and it's all pegged to the market value of the house. So that way, it's a different system entirely. If the house goes under and is worthless, you and the bank are both out the investment. The bank cannot come to you and demand your rent payment for a house that doesn't exist, right? So that's for example one way in which it could work. That's a good question. Yeah, that was right there, a second Lateran Council, 1139. Yep. Deprived of the comfort of a Christian burial. So no satin in your coffin either. No, so what happened? It's a great question. What happened was effectively, I think, the triple contract, and then people not caring. So what's the triple contract? The triple contract was a crafty thing devised by merchants so that they could try to get around the usury law. And it ends up working out to usury, but technically not being usury. So here's how a triple contract works. I'm going to go on a voyage. I think it's going to make a lot of money, but I don't have enough principal. So somebody lends me the money, but then he enacts 3 contracts with me. According to one contract, I owe him back the principal. According to the second contract, I owe him some proceeds from the affair that I'm undertaking. And then the third contract is a kind of a contract to protect the whole thing in case nothing works out. I owe him back the principal, I pay him the proceeds, and the third contract is I pay him, it's effectively an insurance policy. If the ship goes under, I still owe him money. And everyone would look at that and go, well, first contract, he lent you money, you owe it him back, that is just. Second contract, you're undertaking a business that he financed and you're promising a percentage of the proceeds, that is just. Third contract, oh, he's selling you an insurance contract. Okay, we have insurance contracts, great. And if you stack all 3 contracts together, it's a loan at interest. But it doesn't look like one, or it works differently than one. So what happens is, in about the 16th century, the triple contract just became standard. It became an implicit triple contract, so that if you were undertaking an enterprise, you could ask somebody to sign a document you would give the person a certain amount of money at a certain interest rate, and the interest rate was just broken down into the 3 contracts, and over time it became implicit. It was understood that this is what you were doing, even if you didn't say so. So the triple contract was never condemned. It became commonplace, and it became an easy way of justifying usury. It also happened that lots of places, even like the Latin word is mons pietatis, a mountain of piety. It's often translated today as pawn shop. That's not quite the image they're going for in Latin, but the Franciscans, for example, used to lend money to poor people. They would keep something as collateral, and they would charge a very small interest rate to cover their administrative costs. And you could justify that on the basis of extrinsic titles. But when these practices become commonplace and people forget about the extrinsic titles and forget about all the contracts involved in the triple contract, it just looks like usury. So people simply become habituated to seeing it this way, and it just kind of became commonplace. Other than that, I'm not really sure. I think it just kind of happened, and then people didn't really know what to make of it. Well, usury was bad, we condemned it, and now people are doing it, and it seems to be going okay. What should we do? I don't know. So in the contemporary ecclesiastical documents, you see condemnations of usury, but they're usually only condemnations of like excessively harsh interest rates, not interest at all.
Okay, so that is going to wrap it up for this evening. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. Dr. Dugandzic will be here for a few minutes afterwards if you'd like to come and talk to him or ask him any more questions. Also, we have our next event coming up on November 13th. Dr. Michael Foley will be coming here and he'll be giving a talk on drinking with the saints. So stay tuned for that. Thank you everyone for coming and have a great night.